I'm sure all of you know because you are on this call that he is here to talk about the National Data Service, but specifically the Labs Workbench, which is a nifty system that they're building to help organizations or gateways make their resources available. So with that, I'm going to quiet down and let you go.
Great, and you're able to see my slides?
Yes, we can see them just great, and I will be on chat looking for questions.
Perfect.
Thanks.
So hello, my name is Greg Willis, and I'm Technical Coordinator for the National Data Service and also a Senior Research Programmer at NCSA at the University of Illinois. And I'll be talking a little bit about NDS, primarily about Labs Workbench, and more than happy to field questions on either topic as we go through this, so feel free to interrupt if you have questions. So I'll introduce National Data Service and platforms and services that it's currently offering, go into kind of a deep dive on the Labs Workbench, and then towards the end actually turn to a workshop that we held here that may be of interest to participants on this webinar. So the National Data Service, and it was kind of made clear to me early on at an RDA meeting, a Research Data Alliance meeting, this is unusual. The U.S. National Data Service is not actually a nationally supported data service. It's really a consortium, or was a consortium of like-minded groups that had gotten together to try and work towards a vision of national data infrastructure. And this is everything from research computing, supercomputing centers, research data services, repositories, libraries, etc. NDS itself has a core organization that comes out of the San Diego Supercomputer Center and NCSA with steering and technical advisory committees. And kind of one of the core services NDS provides is support for pilots and projects through storage resources, compute resources, and human resources, kind of collaborative project support. It sounds like very similar to the Gateways Institute. Previously, NDS, it's kind of undergoing a transformation right now. It had previously been defined kind of by the consortium itself, but more recently, NDS as an organization has established some memorandums of understanding with various research data organizations, including RDA US, Your Science Information Partners, Midwest Big Data Hub, and EarthCube to kind of figure out the fit and collaboration for the NDS community to kind of provide more or less kind of technical and infrastructure support for a lot of large-scale data infrastructure projects that go towards this vision of national data infrastructure. So that's my one slide on NDS. I know there's potentially questions on that. I'm more than happy to address. So NDS offers software platform, Labs Workbench being kind of core to that right now, some hosting and piloting services. So I'll get into the details of what Labs Workbench is, but we host the Workbench for workshops, tutorials, and hackathons. We also offer piloting services where kind of contributing members will offer resources primarily through OpenStack. I guess it's cloud-based compute virtual machine resources, and then also collaborative support where developers within the NDS organization will actually be involved with the development of data infrastructure projects. And we also host data sets, and these are typically data sets that don't fit kind of traditional research data infrastructure. They tend to be very, very large or have associated compute requirements that make them kind of unique. And I'll give a few of the examples of these through this presentation. So the NDS Labs Workbench, it's an initiative that came out of the NDS Consortium in 2016 that was to create a community-driven platform to actually share and discover research data management and analysis tools to help people within the research data management kind of cyber infrastructure community come up to speed on a variety of different services that are out there that are available to us when we develop whatever our kind of data services and products. It was intended to be an open platform where community members would recommend or contribute tools. And so it was kind of originally envisioned as serving effectively the cyber infrastructure community, but has really evolved into a platform to actually enable access to large research data sets, as well as to facilitate education and training. And the link on this page here is actually a beta instance of the service that's hosted at San Diego Supercomputing Center. And we actually have multiple instances of this, the Workbench platform running for a variety of projects. just one, I'm not going to go into too much technical depth in this presentation, but one thing that I know, the word containers is going to come up a lot, and for those who are not indoctrinated into this space, just a brief overview. So I'll talk about containers, and this is just really a way to package software, the software and its dependencies. It's somewhat behaves like a very lightweight virtual machine. And there'll be two distinct patterns of containerized environments that I'll refer to. One is what's used in cloud environments, which is predominantly these days Docker containers. And this is widely supported through, large cloud providers, Amazon, Microsoft Azure, Google Compute Engine. And then there's Singularity and Shifter, which are used in HPC environments. And while they have some similarities in that they are containerized environments, there are also some distinct differences between them. So increasingly, containers are used to kind of simplify IT systems deployment, but also, and more importantly, I think for NDS, we're seeing it for the packaging of research software. And because of their potential for reproducibility, that all of the dependencies go along with the software in this lightweight package, increasingly containers are actually seen as a way to facilitate reproducibility in scientific research. And that's my one slide on containers, so I won't touch back on that. And Labs Workbench is very much relies on this particular technology. So the Labs Workbench platform currently fulfills three kind of primary use cases. So we see collaboration on complex data projects, workshops, training, and hackathons, and then that primary case, or the initial case, which I discussed, which is the sharing and discovery of data-related tools. And I'll cover examples of each of these. So for collaboration on complex data projects, what we see is for very large data projects, where researchers and developers need to actually collaborate on the development around the data, that remote access and interactive access to that data is essential. And people come in with different needs in terms of what environments they expect, whether it's statistical analysis packages or interactive development environments for the developers. And so for these projects, often the software environments have very complex dependencies. And if you've got a distributed team, as we often do in these research projects, you don't necessarily have consistent environments that are easy to run everywhere. So the idea of a shared platform where researchers, developers, data scientists can collaborate around the data is actually proven to be quite useful. So the use case I'll go through here is a project mainly out of the NCSA. And this is the ARPA-E, it's a DOE division TerraRef project. And they're building a large petabyte scale reference data set for phenotyping and genotyping. So they've got indoor and outdoor sensor platforms, UAV and field data that get collected and kind of centralized through a data pipeline. Then they've got a compute pipeline that's running and creating derived data off of that. And both throughout the development of this data product, which is ongoing right now, and then eventually for reuse in the long term, obviously at petascale, it's hard to reuse this data and move it around. So enabling remote access to this has become central. So Labs Workbench, this is probably the main project where it's kind of employed for this purpose, is used for remote interactive access to data by the collaborators and developers. And I'll actually go briefly, if it's easy enough, to a demonstration of this. For me. Are you able to see my Chrome browser?
Yep. Yeah, we can see just fine.
Okay, so this is the TerraRef, what we call the analysis workbench. It's just a branded version of the Workbench platform. And what they've provided are, and this is just file manager, it's just a basic tool, 5 environments to enable users to interactively access the data. This is a basic Cloud9 IDE for Python development that includes all of the dependencies required to interact not only with the data, but with some of the systems that are employed here. There's a cloud or active data repository. There's a PostGIS database. We see a PostgreSQL Studio, so an interactive SQL environment. And then RStudio and Jupyter environments that also not only for interactive access, but also allow people to run through tutorials to become familiar with the data. And then kind of a novel function, which we also have, is the ability to deploy things that are like X-windowing tools. So in this case, it's very common for people to want to use something like QGIS to look at the data, but moving the data around is quite complicated. The desktop version of QGIS remains more useful, I think, than a lot of the web native applications that are out there for GIS work. So Workbench allows effectively deploying anything with a web interface, or that can be put into a web interface through something like these X-Windows mediation applications, to be deployed, and the data is mounted directly in. So users are interacting directly with the reference data set that's hosted on shared file storage at NCSA. So that's kind of the gist of Workbench and the kind of large-scale data access paradigm. And I'll click over quickly that just to give a sense of the Docker side of this, for those unfamiliar with Docker files, that each of these environments comes with kind of a predefined set of tools that are installed that are necessary to be able to interact with the data. And those environments can be run within Workbench or outside of Workbench, which is awfully convenient for people who do have the capacity to kind of work with this stuff outside of that remote system. Back to the slide deck here, a second use case, and one that we're actively working on now in conjunction with the Midwest Big Data Hub, is a pilot with the University of Nebraska at Omaha to provide access to a database of national bridge infrastructure data. And what they've done is transformed this into a common, to an active database format. It's a Mongo database, and provided Jupyter notebooks for analysis. And NDS is actually hosting the database, the environment with their dependencies, and allowing users to interact with that data via these notebooks directly. And so that's just a second case. So the second primary use case for Workbench that's really emerged is for workshop training and hackathons. And so it provides pre-configured scalable environments. I'll talk a little bit about the architecture later. The data and software obviously included. Participants, you spin up the instance of the software that you want to work through, or the tutorials that you need to work through. There's no installation, and it works on laptops and tablets, etc. And we've run several different training environments. In a short list here at the bottom, an NSF-funded 2-week data science course, tech challenge for Think Chicago, which was a kind of a short-term hackathon on Civic data. We currently host an ongoing tutorial for the Einstein Toolkit community, and then workshops at various workshops. In this case, that was for the TerraRef project, and then a workbench for students of data curation at the University of Washington through the iSchool. So it's a pretty diverse group and a wide kind of array of different application types and data types that are supported in this environment. So the Pi4 Bootcamp, as I mentioned, was a 2-week course, really focused on data analysis and computation methods for math students. And since it was co-taught by the TerraRef PI, they wanted to do tutorials using the Teradata. So Workbench itself, as the environment used by TerraRef to provide interactive access to their data, was immediately usable for running tutorials in the Pi4 Bootcamp, and scaled up to support those students for the duration of that course. And this used kind of common environments for Jupyter, RStudio, OpenRefine for data management, data analysis. And then the Think Chicago Civic Tech Challenge was slightly different. It's a half-day hackathon, so you really, for hackathons, obviously there's a lot of pre-work that needs to be done to set up to make participants as effective as possible. And so Labs Workbench had shared data sets made available by the city of Chicago through their data portal. And then we set up a number of development analytics environments for the students to be able to use. The third case, and again, the original purpose of Workbench, was actually for the deployment of data tools as a sandbox for people like myself coming up to speed in a particular domain. In this case, the interface that's shown on the right there was one set up for the EarthCube building blocks. And so the EarthCube community, which you may or may not be familiar with, provides grants to researchers, developers to produce tools that fit back to build out kind of the EarthCube infrastructure. And so the idea that these could be packaged and deployed in an instance of Workbench that then members of that community could come in and quickly run and run through examples of what building blocks have actually provided was effective. And not every building block fits this paradigm. Not everything can be easily containerized and packaged this way. But the ones that can, obviously, it reduces the barrier to, I guess, people installing and gaining access to them. So I guess I'll pause briefly to see if there are any questions.
So far, no questions have popped up.
Okay.
It's very clear, so I'm following along. That means something.
Great. So current directions, and we're moving towards, I guess, what we're calling a quick start function that will allow us to have kind of a one-click startup process for applications deployed in Workbench. If you're familiar with something like Binder, where you have an easy one-click to launching a Jupyter notebook, same premise that users would be able to kind of advertise, hey, look, I've got a data set or an application that's in this space. If you click on this, very quickly work through a registration process, and you'd be able to have an active running environment. We're improving our authentication, so we're moving into OAuth 2 support, focusing on Globus and CI logon, really keeping within the research community there for the primary authentication. Obviously, if people deploy custom instances of Workbench, other OAuth 2 providers will be supported. We've also been looking at integration with external resources. This includes everything from Spark or HPC clusters. And it really comes down to launching jobs from within Workbench on these environments. And the TerraRef project is another driver for this. So Terra was deployed as part of the Roger supercomputing cluster, or it's kind of a small compute cluster at NCSA. So the data is stored on the GPFS on that cluster. You have access to both Spark and traditional Torque batch clusters for processing. So for users to be able to execute jobs in that HPC environment from Workbench would be a nice benefit. So they can get away from providing logins to Roger on those nodes when folks want to actually process the data at scale. And we're very intent on working with things like the Agave API, and then also Singularity containers in terms of packaging software that can be deployed on Exceed resources. So we've demonstrated the ability to run jobs on, say, SDSC's Comet resource using a Singularity environment that's based on the TerraRef kind of basic data environment to process that data and retrieve it back into the Workbench environment. And then simplifying our installation and support for commercial cloud environments. We're really driven by OpenStack right now because it's typically the resources that are provided to us in our community come from centers hosting of kind of private cloud environments. And on that note, the one architecture diagram. So Workbench itself relies on Kubernetes, which is, if you're not familiar with it, is basically a framework for orchestrating Docker containers or managing Docker containers across a cluster. This is what allows us to kind of scale up and down rapidly. And again, we rely predominantly on OpenStack right now, but clearly Kubernetes is supported across a number of commercial cloud, or actually almost all of the commercial cloud providers these days. But we've demonstrated Workbench deployed at SDSC on their cloud infrastructure, NCSA's Nebula, OpenStack also, as well as more recently on the Exceed Jetstream resource at TAC. So the baseline for running Workbench is a Kubernetes cluster. We provide the tooling to actually get that up and running, and it can run on everything from a single VM to a very large cluster. In fact, we wouldn't even push the boundaries of what it can do. So that's the basic architecture of Workbench.
We have a couple questions that have come in. I don't know if this is a good time or if you want to wait.
No.
Okay, so one question is from Brian, who asks, I'm interested in how sharing works. What authorization model is used? Are shared solutions composable, like statistical functions that can be chained together?
Oh, that was actually not where I thought that question was going.
Double question anyway.
I guess repeat that last part for me.
Okay, so the first part is what authorization model is used. The second is, are shared solutions composable, like statistical functions that can be chained together?
So nothing so sophisticated. And actually, our authorization model is fairly limited at this point. We're working mainly towards authorization for access to the underlying data. Users within their environments are secured by a namespacing mechanism to where you shouldn't be able to access each other's services, but there's no other kind of internal sharing to the level that I think he's asked for there. So our authorization, we're moving towards LDAP internally to add some more kind of sophisticated capability, but what we've really been focusing on is providing restricted access to data, which is typically made available via something like NFS to the system. I don't know if that's a question.
I was going to say, Brian, if you, oh, I said thanks. So, but if you wanted to unmute yourself and clarify it all, you're totally welcome to, as well. But I think maybe all is well. Okay, and then we also have a question from Nancy, and this doesn't necessarily have to happen now, and it may be something you'll talk about later. But what the opportunities are for gateway developers to interact with NDS? Are there limits to the services as far as what is available, and how? And I guess also, like, even how do we approach you if we're a gateway that wants to use it? And also, finally, SGCI, of course, would happily direct people your way. So if there are ways that we should do that, let us know.
Understood. I wasn't going to talk about that specifically, so I will now.
Okay.
So, and it's often odd because I think SGCI sounds like it offers many of the same sorts of functions. I don't know about from the resource standpoint, but it sounds like you offer developer collaborative resources on projects. NDS is not an NSF funded initiative, so a lot of this is done kind of in kind by members within the NDS organization. But the piloting process really comes through, contact me for sure, or contact someone within the organization. But pilot project applications, these are intended to be very low barrier. This is effectively a Google form. And NDS, it depends on as long as it's contributing to research data infrastructure and kind of contributes to that national vision, then it's service hosting, OpenStack allocations at some of these sites, and then up to collaborative support, which is developer time. And that can be everything from developers, I think very similar to the Gateways Institute. So your developers who are familiar with kind of data management applications where we can bring expertise to that, or strictly kind of IT function for supporting hackathon or workshop resources, that kind of a thing. So the pilot project application, if you're looking for something bigger, it's pretty low barrier, or just contact us directly through one of the many email addresses on here, which I hope would be on the contact us page. So you'll get email at nationaldataservice.org, or feel free to contact me as well with any questions.
Perfect, thanks. We also got a clarification, further clarification from Brian. He said, when I asked about the authorization model, I was originally curious about remote collaboration on, say, software for analyzing data.
Okay, and so in that case, probably our predominant model is still something like GitHub. Certainly folks could share common environments, which is uncommon. More likely these are, sandbox environments for you to do your development on, and that sort of collaboration would still happen through traditional source control, software source control management. So we don't offer any real benefit over that at this point.
Okay, that's it for questions at the moment, so you can carry on.
That's it for. Great. So this is the last diagram on Workbench itself before I move over into the workshop. And I think it's a silly diagram, but through packaging software as kind of containerizing software, we see that it makes it really easy for folks to deploy your software, so discovery is easier. It reduces barriers to kind of understanding when it's difficult to install, et cetera. But by also packaging your software in that way, it facilitates kind of scalable education and training environments. And as we see through something like the Terra project, we're actually facilitating data access through that same sort of architecture. So I see this as more of a continuum you see a similar model if you're familiar with Jupyter Hub, as Jupyter Hub kind of expands its capacity, I guess, but that the same environments that we use to provide access to data or access to software can now be used for education and training. And if they're built on these sort of scalable platforms, then it's very easy for folks to scale up and down from a resource consumption standpoint. The last circle there is sort of the research, particularly with software development. Obviously, as a research programmer, often research and development, software development, go hand in hand these days. So the ability to collaborate where you're supporting the interactive analysis from, say, the statistical view or the traditional scientific view to data is often different than the access that you would provide for a developer to actually code components for a system. So those two things, there's kind of a synergy by providing access to both via the same mechanism. And as I don't really I might make this point in the next section about more of a tie to the gateways model, because I think it came up in the workshop. So I'll not say anything further on that for right now.
Okay, so no new questions have come in, but you also have stuff about that workshop that you're going to talk about too, right?
And I wanted to break here just to say I'm kind of going to shift gears from Workbench itself and NDS over to the workshop. So if there's anything further. And again, so
Catherine, this is Nancy. I wonder if you just mind if I break in by audio for a minute, just to clarify.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay. Thanks for the really interesting talk, Craig. I was wondering for your clients, they're coming to you because they have data collections that they would like to share, and they're using Lab Workbench to do that.
That's a case we're
starting. One way they can do it.
Sorry. That's a way they can do it, and that's a case that we're seeing. So if I'll go back to kind of be a little clearer on this. I don't want to kind of falsely advertise things. So the National Data Service we focused actually a lot on infrastructure and not a lot on data in the early stages, a lot around governance and the consortium and getting these MOUs established. But the data that is associated with NDS, and it's exposed in a variety of different ways, often has unique qualities. So I'll look at this MHD turbulence data set. This is the product of the Blue Water supercomputer, NSF-funded research, but Blue Waters was no longer able to actually host for kind of the midterm that data set that would be necessary for the researchers to get traction in their community, to get interest in it. And so they contacted NDS, and through this, the San Diego Supercomputing Center had offered to host this data set on SDSC Cloud. And so access to this data set currently is via Globus or via the SDSC's Cloud Swift interface. And we want to move it to where at least from some subset of derived data and a tutorial or initial overview notebook or environment is available for people to understand the data set is hosted in Workbench. And that's active right now. So NDS is supporting the storage of that data set because it was going to be deleted off the scratch space on Blue Waters. And then we're trying to enable other modes of access to it because it's a non-trivial data set that obviously transferring around is not easy.
Right. Okay. So you've actually got a collection of, and I'm sorry, I know SDSC is a partner. I'm just not as familiar, certainly, as Christine with our work in this. But so you've got a set of actual contributed storage resources, into the terabytes or petabytes that people, if they pass this kind of piloting or other gating functions, then have access to all this data. storage capacity?
Correct. And then we're also, I think NDS is trying to learn from these as examples, because this data set, and many of the larger ones, Terra is a perfect example as well, where the traditional models of data publishing don't fit anymore. So if I have a 200 terabyte data set, the notion of getting a DOI for that, where I need a 5-year agreement for someone to preserve it, is harder and harder when the kind of cost per terabyte of storage and providing access to that is fairly expensive and may not be covered by the original grant funding. So we're trying to understand these cases because they're complicated, and they're missing. There's a lot of national data infrastructure that's very effective right now, and so we're focused often on the ones that are missed by that, I think would be one way to put it.
Okay. Yeah, this is good to know, because we in SGCI have no data storage facilities to offer clients at all. So there could be a really nice synergy here. We work with people a lot on interfaces and sometimes the analytic capabilities. But so I'm just trying to get myself thinking offline, and I don't want to take all the time to do that. But I just wanted to try to clarify why I had you on the call.
And I'll present two other cases here. So the NBI data from University of Nebraska Omaha is very small. I think the actual NBI data comes from the Federal Highway Administration. It's in the orders of tens of gigabytes. But what they needed to provide was actually an active database environment, so something like Mongo, where they needed to be able to host this. And they're trying to build community around this data set. So the Bridge Health researchers are not yet accustomed to sharing analysis in this way. They have not moved into this sort of notebook and shared analysis, code publishing, et cetera. So since they're trying to build community around that, a centralized resource where the Bridge Health community could come and work through their kind of tutorials and examples was something we could provide very easily. That is hosted. The environment, the Jupyter environment and notebooks are hosted in Labs Workbench now on our beta system, along with that data set. So that's a very different case than the turbulence data. And then NDS as a consortium, because it's not one central organization, is trying to federate resources. So the Renaissance simulations and dark sky simulations come through collaboration with, Matt Turk, who's also here at NCSA, his YT Hub. They host a lot of very large astronomy and cosmology data sets. So trying to figure out, if NDS itself can't host, can we define common kind of interoperability between systems that do similar work here? And it's very often large data sets that are hosted remotely that need some sort of compute capacity next to them, as opposed to something that I would upload in a zip file to a Dataverse or to another type of traditional repository.
Great, thank you very much. That was really helpful.
All right, and I'll go one step further, which is you'll see things that are more repositories, where the Materials Data Facility is a project that we collaborate with, and we use them as driving cases to kind of figure out where our trajectory in terms of kind of development and initiatives within NDS. So that's not one where we're actually hosting the data, but we're trying to collaborate with the MDF development because it's helping us to kind of push the boundaries of this kind of research data infrastructure. So there you go. Lengthy response, sorry.
No, that's great. Thank you. Really helpful.
So there are no new questions that have come through chat, just so you know, so you can carry on.
All right, so this is we held a workshop here, NCSA, in August, focused on what we termed as container analysis environments, which is the use of container-based environments for research computing and research data access. I've got links here to the complete report and a number of the presentations for anybody who's interested. And this came out, so NDS, up until now, held twice yearly meetings. And at the last meeting, we had presentations from multiple groups that were creating very, very similar systems. So these were all providing interactive access to research data via Jupyter, RStudio, MATLAB, and other environments. This is the NSF Wholetail project, SciServer coming out of Johns Hopkins, and then our own Labs Workbench service. And so a breakout group at that meeting had proposed a workshop to kind of build community, share information, and trying to address common challenges. The questions that drove this were, why are researchers turning to these solutions, or why are we as developers for these research data projects turning to these solutions? Not as much from the technical standpoint, but more in terms of kind of the research or the science itself. What are the needs for interactive versus non-interactive approaches for analysis? The tension between batch job submission for large-scale processing versus just direct exploratory analysis. And then some more, I guess, detailed questions around how we expose data. This is a challenge for all of us, and issues with security and permissions and running licensed software, et cetera. And we went pretty wide with the organizations that participated. So some were projects, the TerraRef, Cybers, Dark Energy Survey, LIGO, and LSST. We had representatives, I think, actually from the Gateways community, from SDSC, and also the Cyber GIS group here, I think, does some work there. Texas Advanced Computing Center, so the acronyms are all the supercomputing centers. And then Blue Waters, which is hosted here as well and has some kind of novel applications at very large scale of some of these technologies. And very organically, we just let the group kind of devise what the topics were. And recall, I guess it was centered around these groups who are producing what are in essence gateways. I mean, Whole Tail is a gateway in and of itself to allow people to launch computing and analysis environments over data sets, SciServer as well. And so top questions were, as those are moving from what is really cloud infrastructure to wanting to be able to do traditional HPC work and not want to reinvent the wheel there, or there's no way to the level of scale. So how do we integrate with HPC environments was a topic, and what are the differences between things like Docker and Singularity and Shifter on these systems? The Cybers organization was looking to actually add interactive analysis environments to their toolkit within the discovery environment, and we're interested in just learning from the rest of the group common patterns and gotchas and the importance of different types of tools to support, obviously Jupyter being dominant still today. Integration with workflow systems, shared storage across containers, and then the idea if you're composing these Docker images, these are artifacts that can actually be archived or preserved or shared across systems. So how do we deal with that? That's not something that's been solved. Not only talk about a few of the kind of top takeaways here, and actually the first one was the one that I was avoiding at the end of the last talk. So interactive analysis environments, and I imagine there are folks on the call here who also have examples. These are actually being used to complement traditional, I guess, developed gateway applications. So I think we've seen a number of examples of groups that want to deploy something like Jupyter Hub, provide, it's a different but complementary set of services to allow exploratory work, collaboration, sometimes in early stage, or for folks that don't really have funding to develop and host full-scale applications. Often these can serve that same purpose. If they can have something like a Jupyter Hub, they can provide a low barrier interface to, I guess, services that they offer. And that was an interesting outcome for me because I'm actually not very tightly engaged with the gateway community. And this was really hit on by the Cyber GIS group here as they've deployed for a number of projects both, and are kind of looking at the synergy between the two, and that there's often a benefit to offering both. So container-based technologies, this was the top level question, seem to offer the researcher or the research community more control. So either reduce time for installation, trying to think, that's actually, I missed some good points there, but we've got these kind of dedicated environments that can run software, that can run complex software stacks, not exactly anywhere, but a pretty wide set of environments from your laptop to cloud. They offer all of the tooling necessary to access particular data or resources, and are fast to start up. An interesting thing from the HPC community, and this came from Blue Waters, was that the container environments, Shifter in their case, are actually potentially allowing them to extend the viable lifetime of the cluster since they can't upgrade certain components on that system. Researchers that want to use Blue Waters with newer versions of certain software can just package that and include it within the kind of containerized environment and run it within the Blue Waters infrastructure with no additional work from the Blue Waters kind of IT staff or the HPC admin staff. So obviously we're seeing containerized environments become an alternative to traditional VM solutions. So with the emergence of these Docker Swarm, Kubernetes orchestration environments, I guess, and this is an experience at NCSA particularly, we're often looking to deploy our software in container frameworks, not so much on VMs anymore, which is a shift for us. And those environments offer simplified scalability on cloud resources. So an example at NCSA is the Roger computer, which I mentioned the Terra project is using right now, is kind of at its end of life, and there's no other compute resource that's close to the data for them. So the ability to have some scaling clustering capacity through something like OpenStack or cloud resources is very, very beneficial to that project. They don't have to move the data. They can just use a kind of a different compute architecture next to it. And these solutions also have the benefit of simplifying some common IT tasks. But I think the main thing is the more control to the researcher for what goes into these systems. And that's been a real benefit for a number of the projects we've worked with. So also in the context of more kind of research computing or high performance computing environments is that, and this came from the Blue Waters and LIGO example at this workshop, is that these containerization is often aligned with more opportunistic computing strategies like the Open Science Grid, where they're allowing people to do computation on shared resources but don't have dedicated allocations. And so the resource limits for the processes were really easy, I gather, for the LIGO team to containerize. And through shifter support on Blue Waters, it made it a lot easier for them to kind of take advantage of that software stack, not only on Blue Waters, but also on other compute resources that the LIGO group might have access to. Out of that, there were also a number of open questions about performance, but for example, they were seeing things like file system performance improvements with metadata lookups within the containers, as opposed to hitting the shared file system across the cluster. So we looked at a few high-level opportunities for interoperability across these systems, and say particularly something like Wholetail and SciServer or Workbench, and how, let's say, a researcher working with a data set it's within the JHU SciServer environment could maybe leverage that an analysis environment or a container from some other system, or maybe even launch a GHU image on another system that has a similarly structured data set that is not necessarily hosted within SciServer. And shared authentication obviously it always comes up, and that seems to be one of the barriers right now across these existing systems. And there were some commitments to explore trying to find kind of commonality there. That's obviously we've decided to go forward with Globus authentication. That'll in part allow us to be more interoperable with Wholetail. Best practices for sharing images across systems, and there's a lot of trust in using images, off the internet. So the idea that we can come up with some requirements that would allow us to trust each other's images and potentially a registry or a repository to store those seems like a good opportunity. And then Singularity and Shifter, while great technologies, are actually not widely adopted. We're seeing increasingly so SDSC Comet. There are several Exceed resources that actually have Singularity support now. But for instance, for the Terra project, Roger did not. So wider adoption of these technologies will actually even further the capacity for kind of interoperability with these containerized research environments. A little short, but that was kind of the summary of the workshop. And I think it kind of trying to throw a broader light than just strictly on NDS's own Labs Workbench system, that we're seeing a number of these emerge. And I know John Fauner from TAC presented several gateway applications for particular communities that followed very similar models in terms of containerization, both for the IT function, but also for providing interactive analysis to data or other functions that are available through those systems. And I'll stop talking now.
Great. So, we have about 10 minutes for questions. If anybody has any, you can either send them through chat or you send them through chat, and then we'll let you talk directly, just so we can keep track of. Not everyone will be signing on at once to say something. So we'll give you all a moment to think if you have any questions. That was very clear, so I appreciate that, Craig.
Glad to hear.
Yeah. So so far there's nothing specific coming through. I'm curious myself what I mean, I know that you're essentially working on these various use cases to kind of expand your capabilities and push the limits of how you think about all these things. What was there, like a precipitating situation or event that essentially made the collaboration come together to try to do this? What you're accomplishing historically, and so like the history of where this all came from.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I came into it late in the game, and I'm going to go back to one of the early slides here on the origins of Workbench. So I think the original vision of Workbench coming out of NDS was a little strange because it's the idea of cyber infrastructure tool sharing didn't quite fit the grand vision of common data infrastructure. But I think this, from within the NDS community, and this also came, I think, originated probably within Research Data Alliance, within RDA, is that, look, all of these organizations funding data building block or software development projects, there's a really wide landscape of tools that are out there. And if I'm coming on to my own proposal to develop some system, it's really hard for me to get my head around all of what's available. And I'm looking for every possible disqualifying criteria. So if it's hard to install, I might not look at it in detail. And I might be leaning towards things that are easier to install, or things where I have more knowledge of that system to deploy in my environment, even if it's not the best fit. So that original vision was really, let's make it easier for, say, for example, NSF-funded projects, the DIBS projects, the data infrastructure building blocks was one of the, I think, key drivers here, to learn more about each other's tools, and to make it really, really easy for a developer or a PI in one of those projects to come in and explore that landscape. And that got a little traction, but the same technology that could be used to kind of share and deploy these sandboxes for certain research data infrastructure tooling immediately was applied for a workshop. So once we had Dataverse, if you're familiar with Dataverse as a repository software, then the Dataverse community was interested in running a workshop based on that containerized environment at one of their conferences. And the natural bridge for TerraRef was there as well, that, if I can launch Dataverse, I can launch Jupyter, I can launch RStudio over the data. That seemed like a good fit. And it's that the evolving more for education and training and for data access is what we've been seeing more traction within our community. People are interested, for instance, the Einstein Toolkit group, running tutorials or workshops, and the NBI group in terms of exposing data that would have been challenging for them to do on their own, I think. So that's a little of the history, and it is an evolution. We didn't come into the space thinking that we were going to serve RStudio environments for, petascale phenotyping data, but we ended up with that as a driving case.
Thanks. Oh, we did get a couple more questions in. Jack has asked, how does this relate to the Data One effort? I suppose, if at all.
No, and that's a hard one. So, obviously there are a lot of, we'll say federated data initiatives, just within worldwide, but within the U.S. alone. Data One is certainly one of the big ones. We don't have a direct relationship with Data One. I would say the closest would be the Wholetail project, which I happen to be also at least partially involved in. And what Wholetail is offering for Data One is the ability for folks to launch, they call them tails, but reproducible analysis environments over data from Data One. And so what I would hope is that, and Workbench is, I would say, one tool that's come out in this space where Jupyter Hub and Binder Hub and now the Wholetail infrastructure and the SciServer infrastructure are there, and I'm sure there are a bunch of them, that we can enable that exact same kind of process across a wide variety of data. Data one, any of the major repositories, federated repositories being obviously key to that. So we don't have a direct relationship to data one. That question might be there because it's in the slide right there. There are a number of graphics in that little circle that might or might not particularly fit. I think data one is
You have to
obviously
have really good eyes to see all those different.
well, no, but it is a little weird. That's a weird kind of conglomeration of kind of logos. So data one is seen as obviously a major player in this space, but in terms of NDS right now, I think we've got governance associations, folks who are on the steering and technical committees who are within the data one community. We have overlap within Wholetail, but there's not like a direct workbench to data one initiative right now. I actually think that probably that's best fit by the Wholetail project, and we're hoping to leverage as much of that as possible.
Great. We actually have a new question came in, plus still the other one. One question was, would there be API-like interfaces into NDS resources for those who already have constructed gateways who want to interface to NDS?
Yes, and I guess there's two different levels there. So, and it's hard to make this entirely clear, and they might already get it, but in terms of our services, there's Workbench, and then there's I guess what we term the piloting services through OpenStack resources. So obviously OpenStack offers an API in terms of interaction with OpenStack resource allocations, and we use that within our own tooling. Workbench itself does have an API. It's actually not widely used at this point, and something that we'll probably be working to improve. But there have been at least one project who's used it directly, but predominantly it's used through interfaces. But we'd be very interested in exploring API integration, because obviously not everyone wants this interface. And really what we want is the capacity to launch these environments in the back end, understand their status, and authenticate users into them. So yes, but.
Okay, thanks for that answer. Nancy was the one who asked that. And then Brian has another question for you. And I'm going to ask also before you answer, if you could stop sharing so I could let people know about the upcoming webinar. Yes, so anyway, the question is, do you see Workbench someday supporting the publishing of data analysis algorithms? For example, if a scientist wants to let other scientists run the code they use to produce a figure in a published paper.
And that's since we've moved into the research data access space, I think that's a natural future step. It's not one we offer right now. So we're really focused on that exploratory active analysis at this point, but eventually, this is a case that we see with the Terra project, you want folks to be able to run the exact environment for reproducibility backing that research. So it's not something that we have, immediate support for, but it is certainly something we're interested in doing.